Good evening. Welcome to Words on Whiskey. I'm delighted to be back after quite a long absence. And as you see, we've relocated, so there's been some movement going on and some reorganizing, but we're delighted to be back. And I'm particularly glad to have our guest this evening, Mr. Nicholas Morgan, Dr. Nicholas Morgan, in fact. And we'll get into what he's been working with over the last few years, and he's going to bring with us his vast experience of the whiskey industry, over 30 years in the whiskey industry. And let's just bring Nick in and get the show going. So, of course, if you have any questions, there's no better man to ask, I think, than Nick. So, Nick, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me, Sir Gus. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, look, the minute I picked up your book, I had a good read of it. I was enthralled by what was in it, and really the new book addresses something very interesting and a very broad scope indeed. But tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this whiskey business.
Well, yeah, I sort of fell into whiskey by accident in a way, as I think many people do, actually. Yes. My training was as an academic historian, and I'd studied and had a PhD and did a number of research jobs, and ended up researching a project researching Scottish businessmen in the 19th and 20th century, based at the University of Glasgow.
Right.
From then, I managed to get a proper lectureship in Scottish history in Glasgow. And I was doing that when I was approached in 1990 by United Distillers, which was the spirits part of Guinness PLC, having merged with the Distillers Company a few years earlier. And they were looking to appoint an archivist, really to assemble an archive from remnants scattered all over the place in London, around England, and particularly obviously in Scotland, really as part of a project to help rebuild the culture of that company, which had taken a bit of a kicking during the takeover and then the subsequent trial of Ernest Saunders and those people that had been involved with him in the share support scheme to boost the Guinness share price when they were doing the takeover.
This is the case where he had the illness and then recovered.
Well, he had the illness just before he went to prison and was released because of it, and then made a miraculous recovery, as it's known. Yeah. So I got this job as archivist, which I did for 4 years or so, and in that time became increasingly involved in marketing projects.
Yeah.
And in about 1994 or 95, I was actually asked to move down to London and take on a marketing role. And then when Diageo was formed, which was a couple of years later, when Guinness merged with Grand Metropolitan. All of this, by the way, is in the book, not my history, but
no, it's in the book. All right, yeah.
Because it's a bit complicated. But when Guinness then merged with Grand Metropolitan, I somehow became global marketing director for single malt whiskey in the new business, which was a fantastic opportunity. And I did that for about 12 or 15 years or more.
Yeah, fantastic. And when you were lecturing in college, you obviously studied the Scottish history. How aware were you and what was the significance of whiskey on Scottish history? Were you aware of it there? Was it something that you came across, or?
Well, I was aware of Scotch whiskey. Actually, I mean, my dad drank Scotch at home, and right. I married into a family from Glasgow, and my father-in-law's brother had worked as a senior salesperson for the John Begg Company in Glasgow, so they sort of had whiskey in their blood.
Right.
And of course, when I was involved in the what was the Scottish Business Biography Project, the great names of blended Scotch whiskey, Dewars and Buchanans and Walkers, were very big in that project. And I think also you could see from that how the tentacles of whiskey sort of stretched out more widely from a business perspective. And you could also see, of course, another issue that no one should turn their back on, the the impact that alcohol abuse had on communities, particularly urban communities throughout Scotland in the 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah. I mean, you do mention in the book, and the book, for those that aren't aware, is this here, Everything You Need to Know About Whiskey, but We're Too Afraid to Ask. And there is that, there's two comments really in the title of that book. And I suppose the first one is Everything You Need to Know. So you do cover the wide range of topics within it, but the bit about it, you are too afraid to ask. Do you find that there is that level of snobbery in whiskey now is creeping in, that people are actually afraid to ask questions?
Well, I think there are a couple of things there. If you want to sort of break down the title,
yeah.
I mean, I think the everything you need to know bit is not that there's everything about whiskey.
Of course not.
In the book, because that would be impossible. But it does. We did in the book try and cover all the major categories and all of that sort of stuff. But the everything you need to know was really the point that people like to have a really nice view of the industry, and they get very romantic about it. There's a lot of misconceptions that people hang on to dearly. They cling on, like they cling on to a lifeboat. And I wanted to sort of pop some of those bubbles and dispel some of those myths. So that's where this is what you really need to know, really part of the title comes from.
Yeah.
And the too afraid to ask is really, I think, similar. People, I think some people on the fringes of the industry, let's say commentators, people on online forums, discussion groups on social media, like to wear their claimed knowledge and expertise, very, very loudly in everything they do, and they tend to just slap down people. I think very often. I'm a guitar player, by the way, and so when all the internet things started happening, it was like there were all these guitar forums. And I thought, well, this is great. I'm a Fender guitarist, really. That's the guitars I like.
That's your specialty, yeah.
And so we would go on this Fender guitar forum, and there'd be all these very arcane questions about this, that, and everything else. And then someone would post a message saying, I've just bought a Mexican Telecaster and it's really great. What do you think, guys? And immediately the weight of these bulletin boards would plow in on this guy, and just excoriate him for his naivety and, all of that stuff. And whiskey can be very much like that. And I think that does lead people into a state where they're not really too keen to show that they might not be as expert as the bloke, and it normally is a bloke, it has to be said, who's shouting his mouth off somewhere else,
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but it is off-putting, especially for newcomers coming to it. There's some things I didn't mention there. You're credited with the outstanding achievement in Scotch whisky by the IWSC in 2017, and then 2018 inducted into the Hall of Fame. And we'll talk about one other thing later on that you're associated with, which is not whiskey related at all, but I found quite interesting. And it kind of comes across in the book that you're of this type of nature, and we'll come to that. But how did it come about that you started the book? Because prior to that, you mentioned that you have written another book, and that book is A Long Stride, the book about Johnnie Walker. So that was while you were with Diageo.
Yeah, so I spent the last, and I have to say, I was really privileged to spend the last sort of 2.5, 3 years of my time at Diageo researching that book, both in the Diageo archives, which are massive, but also in a number of other places. I sort of half lived in the British Library for about 2 years. So I wrote that book. It was going to be part of the huge Johnnie Walker bicentenary in 2020, and of course I ended up finishing the manuscript in the first lockdown, and the editing process I think we did in the first lockdown as well. And by the time it came to launch the book, there was really no bicentenary celebration at all. And I mean, it's a bit ironic actually, because Johnnie Walker celebrated their centenary in the shadow of a Spanish flu global pandemic in 1920. So I hate to think what's going to happen.
We won't be around for the next one to worry about. So that's one positive thing.
But when I was finishing off the book, I got a call from Sukhinder Singh of the Whisky Exchange in London, who asked me if I'd like to go and speak to him about a project. And they had been approached by Ebury, who are an imprint of Penguin Random House, about the possibility of jointly being involved in the publication of a sort of general book about whiskey, which they were keen to do. And Ebury left it up to them to find the author. And I was very lucky that Sukhinder asked me if I would do it. I spoke to him, explained what I'd like to write about, which he seemed to be, broadly speaking, aligned with. And then I went and spoke to the publishers, and they were really happy with it. So I wrote a very brief proposal, which I think is the paragraph on the back of the book. Actually, that was
all right. Okay.
And then we just took it from there. And I suppose I started. By that time, I was down to about 3 days a week with Diageo. So, or I thought I was. It didn't quite work out like that. But I really started, I suppose, at the end of 2020 and wrote the book really quickly. I mean, it was written in about 6 months or so, 7 months.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's a fantastic read, and as Sukhinder said, and I think as you say in the book as well, it's written for the whiskey lover as well, and to share the different topics, if you like. So the topics that you go through is so how whiskey is made. So that again, it's technical, but it's not drooling in jargon, and it's very straightforward and very concise. And actually, I learned quite a bit of new terminology that I hadn't come across before, like draft has been the results of the milling, the spent milling, and then there's the part on whiskey and wood. I don't want to go through the whole thing, but whiskey and freedom I thought was interesting on how you consume whiskey. Then you talk about collecting, which has become a huge topic lately, and certainly whenever we put something on collecting, it's
hard. It's hard to write a book in conjunction with Sukhinder Singh without having a chapter on collecting. Although I think he was a bit shocked when he read the opening part of that chapter.
Well, 7,000 bottles he has is what you put in the business of whiskey. And again, the business of whiskey is something that's often shied away from. You know, we forget quite often that whiskey is a business, and you know, I suppose at the end of the day, one of the foremost things is to actually make a profit and still exist. So, whiskey experts, whiskey expertise, people in whiskey, whiskey and culture, a huge range of topics there that you do cover. Is there, was it difficult to narrow down, if you like, and you haven't narrowed it down very much, the range of topics that are covered within one publication?
I mean, it was quite so. When I wrote a more extensive proposal and chapter headings, I had about, I can't exactly remember, but I think I had at least 4 more chapters, which it became quite. I mean, I wrote more than, and we published more than I was supposed to, but it became apparent that I would have to cut stuff out. So some elements got mixed in with other chapters.
Yeah.
Probably in a more abridged fashion than I would have liked.
Yeah.
And then some bits sort of got left out altogether, which was a shame. But I think, the book's supposed to serve 2 purposes. I think for someone who is just interested in whiskey and doesn't know a lot about it, I think actually it works very well as an introduction to the broadest canvas, on which you can see the industry painted.
Yeah.
And that's why, for example, that chapter on how you make whiskey, which as it turned out was the hardest one to write, which I hadn't anticipated, is it quite matter of fact. You know, I try to keep it really simple, but also have some technical stuff in there, because I want it to be interesting to people who know a lot or think they know a lot about whiskey. So I defy anyone to read the book and not say they've learned something at the end of it.
Oh no! Well, look, I learned an awful lot, but it's not just that I learned a lot. It was nicely put in place. So obviously, as a historian, you would have written a lot of paper and done a lot of research as a historian. But actually putting that into a concise book is a different skill set, I would feel, rather than just purely historian. And you've done it beautifully. And like I mentioned before, I think you've done it very poetically. But there are some points that I've highlighted in the book, and I think they're relevant in today's dynamic whiskey market, both here and in Scotland. So I thought a lot of what you mentioned about Scotch very much applies to what's happening here. And of course, you know, so many new distilleries coming up. And one of the things then that was interesting is it's not just commentators and enthusiasts who rail against the regulations. Commercial interests, particularly from those who wish to bring products to the market quickly, are often compromised by rules on maturation, minimum age, and the addition of flavouring, leading to some to campaign volubly against them, concealing their financial imperatives under the cloak of campaigning for freedom. You know, so I mean, there is I think we talked about it earlier, with so many new distilleries coming on board and them wanting to stand out, you know, and the financial pressure of not necessarily being able to wait for 10 years to release their own. There is all this dynamic movement against the regulations and trying to stir the industry up. Where do we draw the line as to when whiskey no longer becomes recognizable as what it has been, or is it something that just should continuously evolve anyway?
Well, so that's a really interesting question, and I'll step back a little bit, and then I'll try and end up on that point, which is one that's, I think, all around distinctiveness,
yes,
if you will.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, the situation that we have now, if you'd have asked anyone, if I had have asked anyone when I joined the Scotch whisky industry in 1990 to describe what the industry would be like in 30 years' time, let alone describe what Irish whiskey, which was dead in the water, or bourbon whiskey, which was dead in the water, or Japanese whiskey, which no one really knew about, or Canadian whiskey, which was dead in the water, really, as far as anyone was concerned. If you'd have asked them to just paint you a picture of 2020 or 2022, no one would have described what we've got now. What we have now is unthinkable. And I read something yesterday in a Discus, the American sort of regulator body, in their annual report, that 10 or 15 years ago, there were 50 distilleries in the United States, and now there are 2,400.
That's right. Yeah, it's nuts.
So, you know, so it's everywhere, you know, this proliferation of distilleries. Now, there are a few, and I do talk about this in the book. I try and categorize these new distilleries, and there are a few which are simply enthusiasts. They're simply enthusiasts who want to try and make whiskey, and really are not motivated by any commercial intent. And I suppose one you might think of in if you think of Scotland, certainly would be the guys at Daftmill.
Yes.
Who I did hear the guy that owns Daftmill saying, if I'd known what I know now, we'd have never have done this. You know,
I mean, they did wait 10 years, didn't they?
They waited 10 years. I was at a dinner. Well, I can't tell you where really, but I was at a dinner, and we happened to be put at the same table, and there was someone there who was desperate. They'd only been going for about 2 years, was desperate to get casks off them, and they would just go, no, just not selling anything, you know. And credit to them, I thought that was brilliant. But most of these new guys, wherever you are not in that situation. And although although they like to portray themselves as enthusiasts and we're all a bit hippie and it's all great, we love whiskey, it's very romantic, and all of this stuff, most of them have got fierce professional investors behind them.
Yeah.
You don't build distilleries for nothing. You have to have money to do that and to equip a distillery properly. So they've got huge pressure on them to deliver something back to investors as quickly as they can. Yeah. And of course, many in Scotland, at least, had the benefit of advice from people like the late Dr. Jim Swan, who knew how to set up a distillery so that its whiskey would be quite nice when it was, say, 3 or 4 years old. Quite nice when it was 3 or 4 years old, So now you have the situation where you've got quite a lot of distilleries who are actually producing whiskey that's more or less the same, and they're desperate to sell it. It's quite nice, and they're desperate to sell it at 3 or 4 years old. So they've got to find something to say about it that's different. They've got to find space amongst all this noise that's coming out that makes it different and somehow makes it better than a Glenfiddich or a Glenlivet, the big competitors that are out there and are very well established. So they're trying to find all these niche positions, but increasingly the positions are so niche that they're pretty hard to understand. At the end of the day, if you try and pull apart what they're saying, is sort of not much there. I think you used the phrase earlier, I think smoke and mirrors. Well, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. But what people have done is turn orthodoxy on its head, because some whiskey enthusiasts at least seem to be very happy to spend £50 or sometimes much more on a sort of 50 cl bottle of 3-year-old very nice whiskey. Now some, I suppose, are sort of collectors, or they think it's going to be worth more in a few years' time, all of that stuff. But really that's that's something that people wouldn't have imagined 30 years ago, for sure, when we were all worried about 10, 12-year-old. Whiskey.
How much of it is driven then by collectors wanting to jump on the next big thing?
Well, I think so. I think some of it is. So if you take Darthmill, for example, who've released very small batches now that they've got 10-year-old plus whiskey, and I think it's only available by ballot. And you can be sure that people are buying those on the assumption that current global interest rates are not going to change, and that the so-called investment market for Scotch whisky will still be here in 5, 10, 15 years' time, when they can sell these things and maybe make a bit of money on them. But there's a lot of assumptions in there which I wouldn't necessarily share.
Well, funny enough, referring to this kind of subject, there was one quote again I picked up on. For all the tired cliches that unimaginative PR companies like to throw at us about new distilleries being founded by inspired men and women determined only to make the best possible spirit, turning their backs on big careers to pursue a single-minded mission inspired by flavor, the truth of the matter always lies in the loot.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
it's about the money. It's about the money, and I'm not saying they're not trying to make whiskey of great flavor, by the way. I mean, I'm sure they are, I've got a lot of respect for these people, but that it's this thing that consumers very often lose sight of reality, or they only have a selective view of reality. So they'll criticize a huge company, like my former employer's Diageo, who we're going to kick today. Well, we always kick Diageo, so we'll kick them a bit more. So Diageo can be criticized for being profit focused and only worried about investors. But believe me, the guys at Lindors are as worried about their Russian investors as Diageo are worried about their investors,
Yeah. Well, I think the incumbent and the large, not the incumbent, but the larger players are always an easy soft target, I think. And
coconut shy. Don't tell me.
Yeah. Well, you would have seen a lot of it. Yes. Yeah. But the other thing is that there, and I don't know if it's an English and an Irish thing, and maybe less of a US thing, is that is there almost a shame in wanting to make a profit off something that you're passionate about? I'm wondering, is there something in the psyche there that there's a stigma attached with wanting to be a profitable company?
Well, I suppose Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting cultural point. I mean, I suppose the profit-driven business person is more, one would recognize as being more of an American phenomenon than, and particularly United States phenomenon, than something that you find in Europe. But I mean, there are lots of wealthy business people in Europe, in Ireland, in England and Scotland. And of course, ironically, many of these wealthy business people are the one who are buying all the whiskies. It's not as if they don't know about making money. They've got to make it somewhere to pay the crazy prices they are for some of these limited editions and things.
Yeah, well, that's another topic then. When we come to wanting to stand out, the amount of I mean, Macallan, I suppose, were the Poor Brothers are coming out with limited editions, where they really cornered that market, I guess, initially. But when everybody's doing limited editions, where does the ordinary liquid come, if you like? What stands out?
Well, if we just talk about Scotch specifically for a moment, Sergio, because that's my sort of area of greater knowledge, and it's also I enjoy drinking Scotch more than I would Irish or American. I mean, I have Irish and American whiskey, but I'm a sort of Scotch guy.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm just puzzled about is that people seem to pay so little attention to the great whiskies that are on the shelf and are still available for 30, 40, 50 pounds. I mean, I'm a sort of peaty whiskey guy, so Ardbeg and Lefroy and Lagavulin, although that's about to take a price hike, I think.
Yeah.
And Kalila and these sort of brands. And they're almost, the 10 years old, the 16 Lagavulin and stuff like that. And they're almost ignored these days because everyone's going after these so-called limited editions, which often are not particularly limited in terms of quantity.
Yeah.
And certainly, frankly, very often are not great in terms of taste testing against some of these great standard whiskies,
Yeah.
So it's an odd market, and I think it's really it's in danger of sort of eating itself if it's not careful. I mean,
Yes.
limited edition. Actually, even though I did a lot of limited editions when I was at Diageo, although I think pretty good ones. I mean, I did all the Diageo special releases, and that was Port Ellen and Aurora. I mean, we did some serious whiskies there. But normally, when I think of limited editions, I think of when I was a teenager and having aunts who would have copies of the Radio Times or the Sunday Express or something like that. And at the back of these newspapers and magazines, there were all these pages full of limited editions of ceramic plates and anniversary this and all of that sort of stuff.
Penny blacks.
Yeah, and I think whiskey is in danger of getting itself into that same territory and devaluing the whole category through this stuff. Actually,
I kind of I'm seeing a backlash now almost against these limited editions, and a lot of the single cask releases that you see, they're not sufficient to prop up a business indefinitely. And you see companies and distilleries that have been, especially at the beginning, just creating single cask releases, limited editions, and then coming to the realization that actually they need a core product. They need an anchor to build the brand on. And you're starting to see a lot more of that happen now. So they start off maybe at the specialization and then diversify and create a mainstay product, an anchor product.
Core brands is where your business is. I mean, you may be able to, as the marketeers would say, premiumize your consumer to buy, instead of a 10-year-old, an 18-year-old, and then maybe a limited something. You may be able to do a bit of that, but you've always got to have something for consumers to go back to.
Yeah.
And I think certainly, those core brands become really important in times of difficulty, in times of stress, in times of economic hardship. And suddenly people don't have the same amount of money that they used to have to lavish on some of these more indulgent purchases. Yeah. So as in the UK, apparently we're heading into a time of strained expenditure for many households through energy prices and interest rates and stuff like that.
Likewise here, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's when the good old, Powers 12-year-old or Talisker 10-year-old would come back into their own, really,
Yeah, I think we forget, I think, that they're successful products for a reason. They're not just by fluke that those products are successful, and there's sometimes people look down on those products, which is a bit of a shame. But a couple of questions here. I've got one from with the name Dis up here, which we'll say nothing about, but he just has a general question here about Scotch's shipping to Canada. I don't know if you can answer that or not.
Well, what I do know at the moment is that the pandemic has caused a lot of difficulty for Scotch whisky producers, just in terms of regularly running their business. Obviously, when we've had lockdowns and enforced social distancing, it's been much harder to do the things that they would normally do. Also in the UK, there's been this spate of absences because people have been isolating with COVID. And that's disrupted everything, not just sort of tight into the industry, but also through the supply chain. So if you ask anyone at the moment, they'll tell you, I can't get bottles, I can't get glass, I can't get cork, I can't get labels, so I can't get cardboard boxes. So it's a difficult time. And I'm very much aware that there are quite a lot of brands out there. If you look at the Whisky Exchange, for example, the out of stocks, are incredible at the moment. Just incredible.
Well, actually, there's another question and another point from Laurie here. Good evening, Laurie. Thank you for joining us. Laurie from Whisky Chats. So we talked about the core releases now from different companies starting to emerge. So Laurie mentions the new Dingle release, and I think Ecklandville came out with a core, the 1808 as well, to kind of be the mainstay, if you like, of the releases. But there is a lot of strain. We were talking with Laurie, and we were mentioning that the Redbreast 21 is very difficult to find now. It's almost sold out everywhere, and that's literally a supply issue. And having spoken to producers, getting bottles, getting corks, getting packaging even, it's just proving very difficult. So look, I'm assuming that will clear up before the not too distant future.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, as we see the pandemic receding, which it certainly seems to be at the moment, so all of that will ease, but it'll take a few months to work its way through the system. Of course, we've got Brexit as well, which
you have on top of everything.
Let's not talk any more about that. But we just have it, and you have to live with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that did cause issues up north for us as well, the Brexit, and I think thanks to the work of the Irish Whisky Association and working with the Scotch Whisky Association, that's been put to bed. But one of the other questions I wanted to ask. The skills that you've taken from being a historian to going to writing a book, and then also having worked on the marketing side within Diageo. I won't say there's a little bit of cynicism in there, but there's a little bit of cynicism in the book about marketing speak. How do you do that in an unbiased manner?
Unbiased manner. I mean, whiskey in Ireland, in Scotland, in Canada, the United States, Japan, has been built by marketing.
Yeah.
Now, it's it's interesting actually, because one of the things that people often talk about, I hear people talk about as well, what was it that happened to Irish whiskey in the 19th century? And I hear I've read lots of sort of stuff, people talking about things, but one thing is for sure, Scotch whisky marketing was much better than Irish whisky marketing.
Yeah,
it was just so much better. People like Hiram Walker in the 19th century had brilliant marketing. So marketing has always been there, and with marketing, again, it goes back to the phrase you used earlier. There's always a bit of smoke and mirrors, because that's what marketing is all about. But I think there are times when people create constructs which are quite emotional, quite profound constructs, if you will, which are quite emotional, quite engaging for people, but actually they are just constructs, and they're there as part of the marketing platform of the company. So one you might think about at the moment that I can't see lasting for much longer is sustainability. So in the book, I think I wrote, and it did stay in through the edit, something like, good heavens, I'm sure there's even going to be a prize for the most sustainable distillery.
Oh, there is.
Well,
there are prizes. There are.
It and the thing being printed, that had already happened. But if you think about sustainability, everyone's doing sustainability. There's no one. It's hygiene. The news around sustainability is if you're not doing it. So when I see people putting out press releases going the most sustainable that, or the most sustainable this, or we planted a forest, it's like, come on guys, it's puff, everyone is doing it. So how can that be a point of marketing difference anymore? And that gets us back to the thing you said earlier about everyone wants to have a point of difference, but in fact within whiskey, according to the regulations in different markets, different producing countries, there's a limit to the number of points of difference you can have. There's a regulatory limit. And honestly, if I see another cask finish from some, whiskey's been in one cask, then in another, then we put it in another, then we put it in it's like it used to be with vodka. Double filtered, no triple filtered, no quadruple filtered.
Well, it kind of reminds me of the razor blades with Gillette, where they start off at double razors, and I think they're up to 5 blades now, or 6.
Yeah.
But eventually they'll run out of space. And but one point I did want to ask about marketing, and you will have a great view of this. It's a bit like the Paul Weller song, I suppose. Is that the public gets what the public wants, or the public wants what the public gets? What way around is it? What's driving what?
Well, that's an interesting question. And if you, I'm going to talk about Scotch again specifically, although in a sense Irish whiskey comes into this one as well. If you think about the rise of blended Scotch whiskey from the 80s, and people say the mid 19th century, but really it's the 1870s is when it all starts happening. That was all about giving consumers a palatable and enjoyable spirit drink. And that's what the Scotch whisky blenders in particular succeeded in doing. And this was at a time when people couldn't drink or it was harder to drink good brandy and cognac because of the phylloxera problems. Irish whiskies had fallen out of favor, and very often in England, people say in London, if you went into a pub, even if you saw your Irish whiskey coming out of a branded bottle, it was more likely to have come from Hamburg than it was from Dublin or even Belfast. So the blending thing, Scotch whisky became famous because it gave consumers what they wanted, and increasingly middle-class consumers with disposable income who wanted to drink actually at home. They wouldn't go out necessarily drink outdoors, not quite respectable yet, but drinking at home was the big thing for these big brands. And I think today whiskey has continued to move in that direction. So you get a lot of people, the real enthusiasts, who will say whiskey isn't as good as it was 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 50 years ago. Whiskey is not as good as it was then. Well, of course, whiskey has changed. All whiskies have changed in character over 50, 100 years for a whole variety of reasons, not through any maliciousness on the part of producers. I mean, it's just changed. But one of the changes, it seems to me, is amongst the broad generality of consumers, not being rude about the broad generality, but
Yeah.
amongst the broad generality of consumers, there's a trend towards less challenging flavors. Amongst the experts, amongst the cognoscenti, as they would like to call themselves, it's all about challenging flavors. It's all about, give me the next 100 phenolic, Bruichladdich that's going to, take my throat away. But most drinkers don't want that. And in fact, as we know, a lot of people now want lower alcohol drinks. A lot of people now want drinks that are more mixable, more versatile. And I think a lot of the Scotch whiskies that you're seeing, particularly a lot of the blends that are coming in, new blends that are coming out now, are very much aimed at giving consumers exactly what they want. Some whiskey enthusiasts hate that. They really...
No. And you mentioned it in the book, actually, which in a couple of places, like, enthusiasts looking for the most phenolic content in a bottle, and here we have this, and I'm sure it's happening in Scotland, and certainly, pre-war, certainly whiskey was consumed above 50% ABV, and now it's 40%. But there is a movement now, this cask strength movement, in which people want cask strength, and you refer to it in the book as people searching for the hottest curry.
Yeah.
And a kind of a machoism about being able to take the most phenol content and the most. But I think you're right. I mean, that's not something that the general consumer is looking for these days.
But even amongst the people that are really engaged with whether it's Irish whiskey or Scotch, whatever it might be, the curry thing is quite important, because I think when people come in to whiskey, Scotch whiskey, let's say, and they're often proselytized. I mean, it's like they're coming into a new church. They're full of enthusiasm, so they go for the extremes. So it's got to be the Ardbegs and all of this sort of stuff. Then as they learn a bit more, they realize actually that there's a lot to be said for these beautiful Highland and Speyside whiskies that have got a lot of subtlety, a lot of character, different parts of the flavor map that takes a bit of time to actually understand about being in a glass. And I think that's the same with Indian food, because you do the Vindaloos for a while, and then eventually you start eating Southern Indian food because it's so delicious and light, and appetizing. So that the curry analogy goes quite a long way, I think.
Yeah, you talked about the blending there, and I suppose blending got a good boost, I suppose, when the tax breaks, if you like, came. I think it was 1909. In the people's budget, where it became more affordable for blends.
No. Your history's wrong there. The people's budget nearly killed Scotch.
Was it the people's budget? It was the wrong way around.
Yeah, the tax breaks were earlier. That was sort of 1860.
Is that when it killed it? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. But the one thing then that I found interesting was that you consider, and you mentioned blending as being the democratization of whiskey. Could you just expand on that a little bit more?
Well, it was blending that brought whiskey to the people. It was blending. I mean, I suppose it's not a word I would like to use, but in a sense, you could say it commoditized Scotch whiskey.
Yeah.
It was something that made whiskey more available, more accessible, more enjoyable, and more affordable. All of those things. Without blending either with Scotch whiskey or with Irish whiskey, and I know in Ireland blending was a bit of a contentious point between the Dublin pot still distillers and the Northern Irish guys, particularly. But certainly for Scotch whiskey, blending was the thing that not only democratized Scotch, but it took Scotch to the world. You
mentioned there the North about. Their uptake of grain whiskey and blends was much stronger, and of course they shipped whiskey to Scotland allegedly for a while as well before it was outlawed.
Well, there's a lot of murky stuff in the 19th. Well, up until the 1930s, actually. Yeah. So you had. So you've got sort of different segments of the market. You have what you call the proprietary bottlers. So you've got Powers, Jameson, Walker and Buchanan's, Hiram Walker from Canada. These are all really big proprietary brands by the late 19th century guaranteed quality, unless it's adulterated or a counterfeit, which was a problem that all of those brands suffered massively in the 19th century. But then you have tap whiskey that you're going to go and buy in a pub or a bar. And in those instances, you were going into no man's land. You know, you really did not know what you were getting. And it was very common, for example, as I said earlier, certainly from what I've read in the trade press, who were talking about this all the time, for Irish whiskey in London to be what they call Hamburg spirit. So this is spirit from Germany, maybe mixed with some Irish whiskey, or maybe mixed with some Scotch whiskey and called Irish whiskey. Some blenders in London and in Scotland put Irish whiskey with Scotch whiskey and called it blended Scotch whiskey. And that went on until the 1930s, when it finally was outlawed after a test case that the DCL who brought about. So quite knowing what you were getting, you know, and even with a proprietary brand, sometimes could be quite difficult. You know, it's a bit of a jungle.
I mean, that's something that bottling certainly brought in, was, I suppose, a little bit more of understanding where your whiskey came from.
It certainly did, and I think if you look at some of these lovely old bottles, and just look at the closures and stuff, I mean, these people were really clever. They were on the case of counterfeiters and adulterers from the moment they started putting things in bottles. You know, so although these packs look really ornate, and you might think they're just there to be ornate, there's very often a very commercial reason for some of the things on the packs, you know.
And of course, labeling back then was a much more expensive affair as well. So to counterfeit something wasn't, you know, you weren't going to print off a label on your DeskJet printer at home and get away with it.
Well, but some of the accounts of counterfeiting cases I've heard, even the brand owners would say you just couldn't tell the difference. And very often, of course, it was the same people that were producing the labels.
Of course,
the brands that were producing the counterfeit labels.
Well, I mean, even the molds of the bottles were used again, and you see a bit of that. We have one quote in here: "Blending not only democratized Scotch, it also democratized expertise and connoisseurship. It lowered the bar. Unlike single malts, blend Scotch are easier to acquire a taste for, and generally kinder to a moderately critical palate." The other thing that we can't forget is a lot of the single malts that we get to enjoy today are only for the fact that they have a market to sell on their single malt to produce blends for others. So, you know, that's the basis on which, I mean, Glengoyne is a classic example of Sublime to Sheephouse, and
it's a point that seems to really irritate some people, which I've made for many years, actually. You know, if you want to thank someone for having Lagavulin or Macallan or Glenlivet or Glenfiddich, you have to thank the blenders. Because the blenders are the people that have kept those distilleries open, and actually they've also dictated the style of whiskey that those distilleries make as well. And that's the blenders responding to that changing public taste. You know, so blend, in terms of how whiskey companies work, you know, it used to be that everyone talked about the master distiller and all of that stuff, although very often now all they do is sign health and safety permits, you know. But the people that are really critical in that whole sort of flow chart of what decision making and everything in the whiskey world are the blenders. They're top of the tree, absolutely top of the tree.
I love that bit in the book where you mentioned, you know, the misty-eyed whiskey expert or enthusiast kind of taken in by the Svengali of the master distiller, whereas, you know, it's really the operators that will be doing those roles. And you certainly elevate the position of the blender to be, I think you give huge praise to the blender and also to the coopers.
Well, so just one more point on the blenders. Of course, the majority of single malts are blends.
Of course, you know,
just
from a single place.
everything is almost everything is blended. And you know, so even when you're drinking your Glenlivet 12-year-old or whatever it might be, you've got to thank a blender for that as much as you have a blender for Grant Standfast or Johnnie Walker Black Label. So blenders are just everywhere in the in the production of whiskey. And the coopers, you know, I spent a lot of time when I was in Diageo with our coopers and with our coppersmiths.
Yes.
And these are both, I think, underestimated crafts. And, you know, when people talk about whiskey being a craft, and sometimes they go, well, if you're a big company, you can't be, there's no craft in that. Well, of course there is, because there's craft in the stills, there's craft in the coopering, and there's as much craft in the whiskey making and blending. But, you know, I just think that those casks that whiskey might sit in, well, apparently we learned today for 81 years, as I've read someone's just released.
Oh, really? Who was that?
Macallan have released an 81-year-old.
Oh, is this the one with the hands under the
Yeah,
bottle?
the hands.
I think
It looks like World Cup trophy or something.
Yes, yeah.
Anyway, I'm not going to comment on that. But, you know, it's the coopers have the longest lasting influence on the spirit. And of course, the longer the spirit is in the cask, the more the wood is going to determine its final character, even if it's not a particularly active cask.
Yeah.
So I know that in Diageo, the coppersmiths and coopers would always argue about who was most important. But I think at the end of the day, and I apologize to my former coppersmithing colleagues, I think the coopers sort of get it, you know.
Yeah. Hey, when you go back to production, one of the things that I found brave enough to say, I found you brave enough to say, was, you know, that the flavor really begins at the fermentation stage. And, you know, all this talk of, you know, the water coming from a spring source and the barrels being matured in on cliffs somewhere in the middle of nowhere, you know, and seawater splashing and everything. You believe that their influence is quite minimal compared to the influence of the wood, and also the influence of the stills, the copper itself, the shape and style.
Well, yeah, well, you know, you have two things really. Just trying to keep this at a really simple level. You've got what's now sort of generally called, I think, the distillery character. So that's the style of the whiskey that each distillery produces. And the most important thing, or the two most important things in that, or let's say three most important things: fermentation regime, short fermentation versus long fermentation, not good versus bad or bad versus good. Short fermentations produce one style of whiskey, sort of nutty, spicy. The longer the fermentation, the more fruity, interesting flavors you're going to get. So fermentation is absolutely critical. And there's also an interesting question around yeast, because most distillers use brewer's yeast.
Yeah.
But in most tun rooms in distilleries, there'll be wild yeasts as well.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So there's something odd going on there about a particular location of a distillery and the tun room. Something's happening there that's going to be unique to that place. So you've got fermentation. You've then got your distillation regime, 1, 2, 3, maybe distillations. You've got the shape of the still. So you've got all of that being really important. And then you've got how you condense the whiskey. So if you've got, in Scotland, conventional shell and tube condensers, that's going to give you a lot of copper exposure to the spirit, and that will give you a cleaner, lighter spirit. If you've got worm tubs, and I was always very proud that Diageo had 11 worm tub distilleries, you know, which produce wonderful, wonderful whiskies. They're heavier. At new make style, they're going to be quite sulfury sometimes because they haven't had all of that copper process going on. And they produce these really meaty styles of whiskey, like Mortlach is probably the most famous within the Diageo regime. So you've got all of those things going on. Water, that's not really going to make any difference. Grain varieties, well, I don't really think so. You've got a fundamental maltiness, obviously, about the new make spirit that's going to carry through into the mature spirit. But does one grain variety of barley give you a different taste? Well, frankly, I don't really believe that's true. Certainly not once the whiskey is old enough to be drunk as whiskey. It may make an impact when it's 1 or 2 years old, but by the time it's got 3 or 4 years in the cask, any of that stuff's going to have gone. That's another reason why some people, of course, want you to drink really young whiskey, because it supports the argument around what some people like to call terroir. And I'm not going to get into that point, but that's enough, just enough on that, you know.
Yeah.
So those are the really important things in distillation, and they're the things that count, and they're the things that distillers really pay their attention to, in addition to, of course, the wood, which comes along afterwards.
Yeah. Well, what do you make of the all this? Well, I think you kind of made it clear that you're not too impressed with all these different finishes that are coming around. But in terms of that development, has that been exhausted in terms of what can be done with finishing?
Well, you would have hoped so. I mean, it's an interesting thing, finishing, or as it used to be called, re-racking, right?
Yeah.
Very common practice in the industry. And which is that whiskey maybe hasn't turned out quite as you wanted it to, so you put it in a different cask.
Yeah.
What William Grants and Glenmorangie in particular did, which was genius, was that they took re-racking out of the warehouse and put it on the shelf and said, no, these are finished whiskies, you know. Yeah. So they declared exactly what they were doing, and it was a way of expanding their portfolio, getting more bottles on the shelf, Balvenie Portwood, the Glenmorangie finishes. And that was great, you know, and I think in those early years, some really nice whiskies were being produced. But it's just got to the stage now where it's a bewildering variety of casks with increasingly absurd claims made about what the cask is going to do to the whiskey. And I think claims that must rub pretty tight against the Scotch whisky regulations as well.
Yeah.
Frankly.
Well, I mean, you've got tighter regulations around the wood that you can use, and I think you can't use seeded fruit. You can't have held seeded fruit before.
Fruit drinks.
I think tequila's just been allowed, has it?
Tequila apparently has been allowed. It's funny because the SWA always used to talk about traditional practice.
Yeah, so well, that's what I was thinking myself, but I didn't.
I mean, I happen to know. The first mention of tequila that I could find in the UK is from the early 1920s, when Harry Craddock, who had come across to London during the start of Prohibition, to the Savoy, had tequila at the Savoy, and everyone was quite astonished at seeing this drink they'd never heard of before. So how that is a traditional practice, I don't know. But and I think also it just, to the point that we mentioned earlier, all of this stuff just erodes at the distinctiveness of the product. And the thing that made Scotch whisky famous ultimately, and made Irish whisky famous, and bourbon famous, and Japanese whisky famous, was simply that. It was whiskey from Scotland. It was Scotch whisky. It had a thing about it that everyone knew and understood. And the more you sort of appropriate things from other categories to try and differentiate your product, the more you're chipping away at that distinctiveness. Yeah. And you lose that distinctiveness. I mean, that is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you know?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, and I tend to agree, but then I get accused sometimes of being a traditionalist, you know, and not wanting to be innovative, or, you know, but at some point,
listen, the Scotch whisky regulations, the strictest in the world, have huge opportunities for innovation, for real innovation. But most companies don't want to innovate. They just want to turn a new product around really quickly. So that's why they'll do another cask finish, because you can do it in a year, you know? Yeah. In fact, you can do it in less than a year if you really want to. And so that's, get back to the money, you know, get back to the money. It's a commercial imperative. You can go away and use different grains in Scotland to make really interesting spirits, as has been done recently by a couple of people, including Johnnie Walker, with rye whiskey. Single grain
acclaimed as well.
Whiskey, made from rye, you know, made from different cereals. But it takes time. Yeah. And if you've got investors breathing down your neck, you haven't got that time.
Can I ask you, having worked on the Johnnie Walker book and obviously been in India, what do you think is it that's led to the success of Johnnie Walker? The huge universal appeal of Johnnie Walker.
Let me tell you, and I'll use a prop. if I may.
Yeah.
It's a distinctive slanted label. It's a man with a funny hat,
Right.
and it's the fact that as the brand promised from very early in the 20th century. I can't remember actually what the phrase is. It's on here. Same quality throughout the world.
All right. Okay.
That's and it's a promise. It's a promise that they delivered on.
Yeah. So is it the same? So for the Asian market, it's the same product as it would be in Scotland?
Yep. Yeah. If you have your Johnnie Walker Black Label in Shanghai or Beijing, is going to be exactly the same as it would be in Berlin, or in London or New York. Exactly the same.
When it comes to flavor and it comes to blends versus malts, is there a snob factor there that has justified?
Well, I think there are probably some blended scotches, some cheaper blended scotches that wouldn't stand up to too much scrutiny in terms of their character and distinctiveness of flavor. And I think there are some single malts that, to be frank, don't stand up too well on the same basis.
Yeah.
There are some truly stunning blended Scotch whiskies, and some of the ones produced by people like Compass Box, who try to push the boundaries as far as they can, sometimes a bit further than they should with the SWA. And there's a new company in Leith in Edinburgh called Woven, who produce some brilliant, really interesting blends. Boutique Whiskey have got some great blends in their portfolio, as well as the great standards like Johnnie Walker and Chivas Regal and blends like this. So there are as many interesting blends as there are single malts, and I think people who just refuse to drink blends or say, I wouldn't use it to wash my car windscreen, are really, they're not on the same page as the realities of the industry.
How much is that down to? You do touch on it in the book as well, down to mistrust of blenders, and maybe some of this comes from the Patterson and the Kidd cases that happened in the late 1800s. How much of it is down to that?
Yeah, so I in the Johnnie Walker book, I talk about the issue of adulteration. And I don't mean adulteration of whiskey. I mean the whole issue around adulteration of other food products, milk, butter, margarine, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And that did, I think, lead to a questioning very publicly of what the grocer did. And what grocers did traditionally was blend things. That was what being a grocer was, one of the principal skills of being a grocer, whether you were blending tea, or blending whiskey, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So certainly in the 19th century, there was a sense that blending was somehow adulterating a product. But if you think that's a long time ago, I mean, I know people have long memories, but it's a long time ago. And if you think today, no one questions the fact that champagne is blended. No one
or tea or coffee
or teas or coffee or olive oil. All of these things are blended, and you rarely find people. I mean, there are a few tea snobs, and there are a few coffee snobs who just want single estate teas and all of this stuff. But blending has its place, and of course, it produces unique products. And actually, if you talk about innovation and cask finishes, well, you can innovate a lot more with blending. Than just you can
permutations. Maths determines that. I have a quick question here from Whiskey Lovers Society. How do you manage to still have more than 40% ABV after 81 years in a cask?
Hey, you asked them. It's 41.6% ABV. You better go and ask them about that. It's quite remarkable.
That's a very close call. Yeah, very close call. I found one thing quite interesting, and I kind of think it's probably more relevant in England and possibly in the UK, where society is more class driven. The kind of link between connoisseurship, aficionado, and class. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think I mean, the basic point, I suppose, Sergios, is that connoisseurship requires surplus disposable income to indulge in whatever it is that you want to be a connoisseur of.
Yeah.
Whether it's whiskey or wine, or books, or sports cars, you name it. Connoisseurship is all about being able to spend indulgent money, if you will, on things that you don't need, and that obviously is something that a large proportion of the population of any country would find quite difficult to do. It's a bit different, I would suggest, in some European wine cultures where wine is truly democratized and more accessible, and people will spend a bit more money on that.
Sure.
But certainly, I think in the UK, and I think in the United States, probably even more so in the United States, actually, connoisseurship comes with a price tag, and that price tag is ultimately going to take you back into the class structure of whichever society you're in.
Yeah. One of the points about collecting that I found interesting, I'm trying to find it here now, was firstly the psychology of collecting, which you introduced, and you mentioned Freud, some sexual references, which of course Freud would come back to, but also the sense of being in control of collecting. How do marketers play to this kind of collecting and collectability side of things?
Well, I think in different ways, but obviously, you have to look at Macallan to see how they have played the trump card on collecting, and Macallan sort of dominates the world of collecting. It dominates the world of whiskey auctions, and strangely enough, coming up not far behind Macallan, of course, are some of the more desirable Japanese whiskies.
Sure.
Which again, no one would have thought about maybe even 5, let alone 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's partly about having a reputation, and then it's partly about having a pipeline of these collectible items and being able to put them out there without ending up on the back pages of the Radio Times with the plates and the toy cars and all of that stuff. And certainly so far, so far, brands like Macallan have managed to do that very determinedly, very strategically.
Well, you've been spotted here, Laura Hemme from Row & Co. I'm sure you know her. Not of us lowly distributors. So she does more than doing permits, so she says. But
sorry,
fantastic.
Laura, I apologise for that.
Thanks for joining us, Laura. It's great to have you on. She's doing a fantastic job there. Actually, I wanted to ask you, you would have been, of course, there when Diageo bought over Bushmills.
Yeah.
Was it 2000? And then let it go. Was it 2014 they sold it?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
What was it's a question I get asked often. What was the reason they moved in and then moved out?
Well, I was not a party to the strategic thinking on that, so I can only tell you how I saw it, and I think the reason for getting in was that they wanted to have a footprint in Irish whiskey.
Yeah.
And Bushmills, with its both blends and single malts, was, I think, something that they felt they understood in that respect. Yeah. The reason that they got out, I always understood, was principally because they had an offer that they couldn't refuse, which, as you know, involved Diageo getting something back in the tequila line of things, as well as losing Bushmills. Yeah. And I think also it always felt that as though, to me at least, as though the company didn't quite know what to do with Bushmills, or it wasn't quite prepared to invest what it needed to in order to achieve what it thought it could do with Bushmills. Yeah. But I wasn't surprised to see Diageo get get back into the Irish whiskey category, and I was involved in some of that with the early stuff on Roe & Co.
Yeah.
You know, and I was delighted that not only did they go back in with a brand, but they went in with a will to build the distillery that Laura's now at. In fact, I was very vocal in saying that they really had to do that if they wanted to be credible in the world of Irish whiskey.
Yeah, no, it's great that they did a fantastic job down there. One question again in here, and this is probably an investment question. Do you think that Macallan will still have the market share in the next 5 years in regards to investment?
Oh, well, I mean, who knows? The investment market is so crazy in some respects. I mean, I think it might not have the same share, but I think it will have the same dominance, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there are more brands coming in there, and some of these new whiskies that apparently are collectible, like Daft Mill, which we talked about earlier. But I think it'll be a long time before Macallan goes away, not least because so many people have got so much money invested in it. I mean, that is a huge bubble, you know,
Yeah.
a huge bubble.
They mentioned Springbank.
Yeah, well, I haven't been able to buy a bottle of Springbank to drink for I don't know how long. So, which I think it's one of my favorite whiskies, really. But
yeah, very hard to get their 12-year-old own barley one,
it's just impossible to get any Springbank at the moment. But again, I'm sure they're struggling as much as everyone else with all of these supply issues. You know.
Yeah. One thing we did, or we do share in common, I think, at least from the tone that it comes across is the if you like, the disdain for cask investment schemes or casks as a means of investment, especially by brokers. Is that something that's very prevalent now in Scotland as well?
Well, it is. I wrote an article for a blog recently about cask investment schemes in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which were Scotch whisky investment schemes being run in the United States and in the UK.
Yeah.
And if you look at the press advertisements and the claims that were being made way back, what's that, 40, 60 years ago, 50 or 60 years ago, they are almost identical to the claims that are being made in all the online adverts that you see in your social media feeds now. You know, preposterous claims about the amount of returns that can be gained on some of these things. And, you know, don't get me wrong. I mean, I've got a cask sitting in a warehouse somewhere, which I've just bought for fun.
Yeah.
And for
there's a difference buying it for fun as opposed to.
Clear, you know, you can buy a cask and with friends and mates, and it's just a fun thing to do if you can afford it, if you're privileged enough to be able to afford it.
Yeah.
But these investment schemes, you know, if you want to invest in whiskey, buy shares in Diageo, buy shares in Pernod Ricard. You know, that's how you're going to make money out. I mean, if you've looked at the share price of Diageo over the past couple of years, I mean, that's whiskey investment. Why anyone would want to get involved in one of these schemes where you don't have the fun of owning your own cask and bottling it and putting a label on it and all of that stuff? It's just crazy. It's just crazy.
Now there's a broker taking. But was there one of those cases in the late 1900s where one of the investment schemes was double selling casks, selling the same cask twice? Was that one of the things?
I think you might find that's something that hasn't gone away, you know.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Or selling no cask 3 times would be
selling no cask. Well, I think very often it's a way of doing business for even some of the more legitimate traders, that they don't own the casks when they sell them. They'll go out and buy them once they've sold them, you know.
Yeah, that's a danger.
I mean, really, it's just not something it's worthwhile putting your money into.
Yeah, I don't think it's probably as prevalent in Scotland because you haven't had the sudden spurt of growth that we've had here. Like I said, from 40 distilleries now, from a couple in 20 years or so. So it's really something that people are entering the market as an investment. And you do talk about the difference between speculators and collectors.
Yes, I mean it's a bit hard actually, because all collectors will buy and sell. That's part of the collecting world, you know. I mean, that always has been. But it does seem to me, if you look at people I mean, you'd never get the data from a whiskey auction, but if you could analyze people who were buying stuff, particularly on the secondary market, I do think you have collectors who are going to buy stuff and never open it and never sell it, or they might just sell it in 30 years' time when they get bored with it or something. But their ambition is to have this stuff on their shelf.
Yeah.
And to know that they've got it and someone else hasn't, which is one of the
Well, I
big
think it's partly the hunt for bottles as well.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a few here that I won't be parting with no matter what.
Yeah.
But the enjoyment of actually seeking for them.
And I talk about that in the book, and talk about this wonderful essay written in the early 20th century by a book collector.
Yes, I must get that book. I saw that.
It's delightful. It's one of the most delightful reads, and it's not long. It's only about 10 pages or something, but highly recommended.
Yeah.
So there are those sort of collectors, and then there are certainly people who are just turning a buck, because you see all of these limited editions, so-called limited editions, appearing on the auction sites the next month. Yeah. So some people are in it just to try and make a fiver, or something, which is pretty pathetic.
Well, it's a return.
It's a return, but really, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then some people are in there to hold for 5 years or 10 years, and then they'll sell, and they think get the big bucks. And these are the speculators.
Yeah.
And I do think a lot of that secondary market really is driven by speculation rather than collectation. There's no such word. And that's just because increasingly I think these limited editions aren't really collectible.
Yeah.
They don't. There's something about it. Something has to be really special to be collectible.
Well, this the Game of Thrones collection, for example.
Yes.
That came. I mean, secondary market.
I may add.
That wasn't your hand in that at all. No, you're washing your hands. But I mean, there's an example of a limited edition that's now available for less than they came out at.
And it's still available. I mean, it's still available. Yeah. It's still in retail everywhere, So So that's a pretty good example, but it's not the only one. I mean, and goodness me, I wouldn't blame Diageo for what they did there, because one of the pieces of thinking behind that was to actually try and reach new demographic with their brands, which I happen to know from stuff that I saw that they certainly had, remarkably so. And that's growing the category, so that's all for the good, for everyone's good.
Well, one of the things that I liked in the book is that you demystify some of the romantic notions that there are about the production of whiskey, and where the whiskey is stored, where the grain comes from. But one element that I didn't realize actually, and was that floor malting. There aren't many floor malters out there, and the ones that are there are largely for show. But I never realized there was that's where the monkey's shoulder expression came from sifting the barley.
Well, yes, apparently. I mean, I'm not sure that many people knew that it came from there until William Grant released Monkey Shoulder and told that story.
Right.
But supposedly it was a phrase used by guys that worked on the floors,
Yeah.
But certainly it's strange that even yet you will see on some single malt distillery websites pictures of guys on floor maltings when they don't even have a floor malting of any size or description, and somehow paint it as being romantic. Everyone that I've ever spoken to who worked on a floor malting told me it was the worst job you could ever do. And not
the
just
dust. Yeah,
the dust. So it wasn't just the repetitive strain injury, which is the monkey shoulder.
Yeah,
it was the dust, which of course came with a whole range of health hazards, which is one of the reasons why floor maltings, went.
Yeah, another thing that
of course, they were hugely unreliable in terms of producing consistent malting quality.
Well, that totally makes sense. Is that you can't get the same level of consistency manually doing something like that, I guess, and much more prone to climatic conditions, I imagine. What do you make of the godlike status that master distillers have now?
Well, it's
perusing around the world.
I've got to be careful what I say now that I know Laura's. Well, I can't cause any more offence.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a certain, I mean, it's changing a bit actually, but I think there was a certain, certainly maybe 10 years ago,
Yeah.
you know, there were a group of guys who'd been around for, and they're all blokes, of course, who'd been around for a long time, and they were in this sort of caravan of whiskey festivals and product launches all around the world. And frankly, it always seemed to me they were a bit like a group of superannuated music hall artists going around and doing their stuff and telling their rather unpleasant, risque jokes and things like this to increasingly unamused audiences. I think now, I mean, obviously we haven't really had whiskey festivals for a couple of years, but I think now the general level of audience at events like that expects something more. Something I can't comment.
We didn't say that. We didn't say that. No.
Something more than that sort of presentation, and of course now you have a much more diverse group of people who are talking to you about whiskey as well, which is all for the better, you know.
Well, let's talk about that diverse nature of conversation that comes in, and obviously hugely influenced by the internet now. What's your take on all the information that's coming over the internet now? Obviously, we've had books, we've had magazines, we've had other methods, opening up of distilleries, tours, and distilleries being far more open now about what they're producing and how they're producing it. But the internet has really changed things massively, you know, and even in the last 5 years, I can say the number must have quadrupled at least. But you have the old mainstays, Malt Maniacs, Whiskey Fun. You know, you had some of the blogs on the Whiskey Exchange and a few other sites as well. But now everybody's an expert, or everybody has an opinion anyway. That's for sure.
Yes, they do, don't they? I mean, you know, it's not for me to say that people shouldn't have opinions, but I just wonder sometimes if the world needs so many podcasts of, again, mostly men sitting down in their dens, you know, trying to describe what these different whiskies taste like. I mean, you know, the internet's a good force for good, it's a force for bad, and I think, you know, Whiskey Base, which is this huge website of tasting notes, I mean, I think that's a great thing to have. That I think is a wonderful resource. You know, if you really want to know what people think about a whiskey, go and look at Whiskey Base. You know, and you get fairly, I mean, there are always sort of crazy extreme comments, but you get people who are really just trying to say, this is what I thought of this whiskey, I really liked it because X, Y, and Z. And that I think is great. But honestly, I'm not sure, even possibly a bit like us, I'm not sure who sits up watching two sad blokes talking about whiskey at 8 o'clock at night.
Speak for yourself, but yeah, I mean,
like I think we said earlier, the one thing I don't like is that you do get a lot of, you know, you do get bullying behavior and shouty bullying behavior on some of these websites and conversational sites and things, which I abhor. I mean, I think that's just so boorish, you know.
Yeah. The ability to stay independent is a difficult thing, and I'm sure it's actually, even from your point of view, you can't easily go and say Johnnie Walker Red Label is rubbish, or, you know, you can't lambast something easily. But what do you make of brands and magazines, and sometimes you get books written about particular distilleries? You know, how do you recognize you are getting an objective view of something?
Well, how do you ever recognize that? I mean, that was one of the concerns writing the Johnnie Walker book.
Sure, I'm sure it was. Yeah.
To be, you know, this isn't a brand book that just talks about how great the brand is and has a photograph of the chairman with his board of directors in the final chapter. So there's none of that. Yeah. And it is just for the record, and rather to the surprise of the publishers, it is meticulously footnoted. So they didn't realize they were getting all of those footnotes in it. And that was just to try and demonstrate it was objective, a real open account.
Yeah.
But it is hard sometimes to ensure that. And I mean, yeah, if a brand produces something as a piece of PR,
Yeah.
purely, then it's just going to be talking the brand story, you know.
Yeah. But I
If
think
you
brands
have
are very aware of that now. You know, brands are, I mean, I see it even in our publication that brands are very aware that over talking a brand or doing something that's clearly PR is a negative connotation with it now.
well, it can be so, but that's why they try and talk so much through the mouths of influencers.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
is a whole different subject, and we certainly haven't got time to get into that. But
No.
you know, because this whole world of whiskey influencers, you know, they are given information and they transmit information, and they're
Yeah.
given information with inducements of bottles and trips or whatever it might be to help persuade them to transmit that information. There's no critical thought in the world of whiskey influencers. And as I read in an article in the Spectator magazine just before Christmas, without criticism, there is only advertising.
Yeah.
Without criticism, there is only advertising. So that's what you get from whiskey influencers, no matter how much they might try and make you jealous of wherever it is they've been or where they're going and all that sort of stuff, you know.
Yeah. We were talking about the marketing side of things as well. A quote I did enjoy from the book is new ventures turn 150 years of convention on its head and persuade consumers that drinking 3-year-old is really what aficionados should be doing.
Yeah, well,
is that as a result of the pressure, obviously, to turn out something fresh and new and get it going?
yeah, of course it is. That's back to that point around in you know, everyone's got investors. Everyone needs to turn some money on their whiskey. And you know, if when I had been in marketing, when I was in marketing at Diageo, if I had managed to sell a 3-year-old single malt for £60 or something, I would have got a big bonus.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, that's a commercially driven thing. And you know, it's and it may sound cynical. I love whiskey. I love the whiskey
It comes
industry.
through.
I love the people, you know, for all their idiosyncrasies. I love it. But you do have to be realistic about it. And that's what I've tried to be all the way through the book.
Yeah, and actually you've done that really well and captured without being critical. You know, you haven't been damning of those that aren't, but you've highlighted the points that such and such is perhaps marketing driven. What are the things out there in the future that excite you about the whiskey industry, and perhaps maybe things you've heard about the Irish whiskey industry?
Well, I mean, I think I think for those people who seriously want to do new things, by which I don't mean put whiskey in another bloody cask,
Yeah,
but I mean really seriously try and look at parts of the production process that will produce different and distinctive styles of whiskey, either to be consumed as single whiskies or to be blended, however it is. I think that's where a lot of the excitement resides. I really do. And I know a lot of people are doing it. I mean, and it's not just the small guys that are doing it. I can tell you the big guys are looking at all of this as seriously as the small guys. And in fact, the bigger guys have been looking at it for donkey's years.
yeah. I think there's always that misperception that, you know, it's only the newer entrants and the smaller players that are innovators. But I would say it's, in fact, it'd be quite the opposite, perhaps.
Well, you know, I used to say that there probably isn't any experiment that people like Diageo haven't already done.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
You know, they've got almost 100 years of science behind them, you know?
Yeah. For you, then, what's the future in terms of what you're planning to do? You 2 successful books that are published. Are you looking at a third? Is this something you're going to pursue?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm looking at a number of things at the moment. Obviously, the continued pandemic has made it a bit of a strange time to leave a business and try and sort of start a second or third career, I suppose. But I'm doing some writing, and I have 2 or 3 different book projects which I'm trying to put together One is really very historically focused, lots of research, which means it will probably never get written. And then a couple of more general topics, which I want to explore, which actually expand out a little from just whiskey and spirits into more general areas of interest as well. But that's work to be done on book proposals and trying to find publishers, which isn't that easy.
Yeah, I mean, being a historian, obviously you bring a different skill set to writing, and the research that you do is is more thorough than it would be. I presume you're not going to Google and doing searches and then just regurgitating information, which you do, of course, online. You see a lot of that. Of course.
I'm going to pretend you didn't even say that. Just look at, when you get the Johnnie Walker book, just look at the footnotes. There's no Google in there, I can tell you. That's archive research. And the interesting thing is, in the same way, in a sense, that there's so much to be unlocked, I think, about whiskey through proper innovation and you know, the innovation that takes time. So there's so much to be unlocked about the history of whiskey, both Scotland, Ireland, North America, because these archives have really never been looked at. You know, whiskey has been served very poorly by historians, it has to be said, for the most part, as I sort of discuss in my book. And the thing about history is that you need to understand history. You need to understand where you've been to understand where you're going, you know?
Yeah.
And I think history is so valuable in terms of that in the spirits industry.
Yeah. Oh, well, here. Look, I mean, the book, I say, I really enjoy the book. Obviously, they can purchase it anywhere, but you know, there were some notes I made. You know, it's clear, it's concise, it gets to the point, it's jargon free. It's very clear. It covers such a broad range, and without seeming disingenuous, it's actually very poetically written as well. So. You know, I just wanted to maybe close out on a section that I did highlight that I thought was quite poetic. And yeah, nobody's going to have to buy the book now if I keep on reading out bits of quotes. But I did want to end it on this note because I didn't think it was really eloquently written, and it didn't have to be, you know. But it just makes it so much more of a pleasure to read. But there's something about words in whiskey. Think about all these words crammed in very small print around a flavor wheel, each a whiskey word to provoke a memory of a place, a person, or a thing. Each single whiskey word is the mother or father of many others. Words tumbling like a small highland spring that ends up as a wide meandering river heading to the ocean, an ocean of words, and so on. So beautifully written. I mean, that could be you know, so congratulations on putting together both fantastic subject matter, beautifully illustrated, beautifully written, and you know, I wish you the best of luck now with all the rest of your writings. But you'll be doing well to top this one now, I think. Well,
listen, that's really kind.
No, it's genuine. It's genuine.
And I'll say something else, actually, if I may. It's quite interesting having something you've written read back to you.
I can imagine. Yeah. So well, hopefully it's not like listening to your own voice again.
No, it's not. It's not as bad as that. I hate that.
Yeah. Well, look, Nick, thank you so much for everything you've done, and thank you for the help you've given me in working on another article. So, wish you the best of luck. I think, you know, it's great to have a third career, and you're playing a great job at it. And I hope we'll get to meet sometime soon.
We will. Thank you so much for having me. It's been
it's been a real pleasure, really great insight. So thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Well, thanks to Nick there for joining us. I love having an insight from somebody that really knows what they're talking about and not being afraid to speak it either. So thank you for your great questions. Thank you for joining us. We're glad to be back. We're going to be regularly back and hopefully bring you some interesting topics that you'll enjoy. So good night, God bless, thank you very much, and please do support the channel if you're interested in it and have enjoyed it. Please do subscribe, and we'll have lots more of interesting things to come. Good night, Sláinte.